I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. The Great Gatsby. Color and Time. Jordan and Daisy are first seen in white dresses, but neither is as innocent as this choice of color might suggest. Color in The Great Gatsby is symbolic of the book's themes. Gatsby wears a pink suit and drives a yellow Rolls-Royce, hues denoting his desperate need to make an impression. One of the book's most prevalent symbols is green, the color of the light at the end of Daisy's mooring dock, which Gatsby gazes at yearningly from across the water. In the final pages, alone in Gatsby's empty garden, Nick has a vision of the fresh, green breast of the New World, glimpsed by the first settlers to reach Long Island. He then muses on Gatsby's belief in that symbolic green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It is here, in the green light and the green land, that the novel's concerns with individual and national destiny converge. At the end of the book, feeling that the East is haunted after the book's final tragedy and distorted beyond my eyes' powers of correction, Nick returns to his Midwestern home. In his shifting, worldly, highly nuanced perceptions and sympathies, Nick is as much the novel's subject as Gatsby. The thought he leaves us with is that the past pulls us back irresistibly, dreams of progress are fool's gold. Belated acclaim. When he was planning his novel in 1923, Fitzgerald wrote that he wanted to produce something extraordinary and beautiful and simple and intricately patterned. He achieved this ambition with panache, but the book initially received mixed reviews and sold poorly. By the time of his death, Fitzgerald thought of himself as a failure. During the last year of his life, only 72 copies of his 9 books were recorded as sales in his royalty statements. Nowadays, The Great Gatsby and Fitzgerald's subsequent work, Tender is the Night, are widely regarded as among the greatest U.S. novels ever written. Tender is the Night follows a narrative that fictionalizes strands in Fitzgerald's deeply troubled life, including adultery, mental illness, and an acute sense of personal and creative failure. The Great Gatsby is the more acclaimed of the two novels. It is particularly admired for its forensic exposure of a flawed milieu, its finely judged prose, combining first-person informality with superbly cadenced description, its brilliantly telling dialogue, capable of revealing a moral vacuum in the briefest of exchanges, and its structural accomplishment, for example, in the placing of Jordan's account of Gatsby's backstory, which is both a flashback and a flash-forward. Like the rest of the Lost Generation, Fitzgerald may have been reacting to the mood of his times, disillusionment, a loss of moral bearings, and the focus on the material rather than the spiritual, but his novel transcends the moment of its creation. This is in part because of its continuing relevance in today's climate of celebrity, corporate greed, and a world economy driven by inflated asset prices. But the book is also timelessly important because every aspect of it, aesthetically, bears witness to Fitzgerald's unassailable mastery of his art. The characters in the novel are fleshed out by the book's narrator, Nick Carraway, who has come to New York to seek his fortune. He befriends Gatsby, who is in love with Nick's beautiful cousin, Daisy, who is in turn married to the boorish Tom Buchanan. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. The Great Gatsby. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Francis Scott Fitzgerald was born in 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, USA. In 1917 he dropped out of Princeton University to join the Army. He fell in love with Zelda Sayer, the daughter of a judge, marrying her after his first novel, This Side of Paradise, brought him success, at the age of 24. He supported the family by writing stories for popular magazines. His second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, confirmed his reputation as chief chronicler and critic of the jazz age. In 1924 he moved with Zelda to the French Riviera to write The Great Gatsby. The couple later shuttled between France and the USA. Fitzgerald had a troubled relationship with alcohol. After Tender is the Night came out in 1934, he struggled for 2 years with drink and depression. In 1937 he tried his hand at writing for Hollywood, and died of a heart attack there in 1940, aged 44. Other key works. 1922 The Beautiful and Damned, 1922 Tales of the Jazz Age. 1934 Tender is the Night. See also, The Waste Land of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, The Outsider. In context. Focus. Weimar-era experimentalism before 1915. Metamorphosis, a key early anti-realistic text by Franz Kafka, influences several other modern German-language writers. After 1931, 32. Austrian author Hermann Brock's trilogy The Sleepwalkers experiments with form, changing genre according to the plot. 1930, 43. Austrian Robert Musil's novel The Man Without Qualities is structured as a tour of ideas through which the central character attempts to define himself. 1943. Hermann Hesse's use of Jungian psychoanalysis and Eastern mysticism in The Glass Bead Game results in a combination similar to the later genre of magic realism. Although the 15 years after the end of World War I saw hyperinflation and mass unemployment in Germany, it was also a time of a great flourishing in the arts and sciences, known as Weimar culture. Many leading intellectuals were Jewish, and the period came to an end with Hitler's ascent to power in 1933 and the rise in anti-Semitism, when thousands of Jews fled Germany. New forms for a new world. While the Weimar era lasted, German-language literary experimentalism was ambitious in its attempts to express the complexities of the modern world, and Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Doblin was a key work. It is the story of a low-level pimp, Franz Biberkopf, who struggles to make his way in the criminal underclass after being released from prison. The characters speak in the almost untranslatable argot of the slums of interwar Berlin, and the novel is a dazzling exercise in literary montage. At times it takes the form of newspaper stories, street ballads, speeches, and extracts from fictional books. The narrative incorporates stream of consciousness and a mixture of first and third-person viewpoints. Through this complex experimental technique, 1920s Berlin itself is given vivid expression, leading Berlin Alexanderplatz to be seen as one of the great Großstadtromanen, or big city novels, which focus on life in urban areas. German fellow citizens, never has a nation been betrayed more ignominiously and more unjustly than the German people. Berlin Alexanderplatz. See also, Metamorphosis, The Magic Mountain, The Man Without Qualities. In context. Focus. The Harlem Renaissance before 1923. Jean Toomer publishes his first novel, Cain, a key modernist work evoking black life in the South. Of mixed race, Toomer preferred to be termed an American writer rather than a black writer, but was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. 1923. Age 21, Countee Cullen wins an award from the Poetry Society of America for his poem, The Ballad of the Brown Girl, about a doomed interracial romance. He becomes a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance. 1934. Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes publishes his first short story collection, The Ways of White Folks, focusing on race relations. The title is intended to be mocking. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s, or the flowering of Negro literature, as the U.S. author and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson put it, was an important awakening of African American cultural pride and identity. The movement centered on Harlem, New York City, USA, and began in 1924 when Opportunity magazine held a party to introduce black writers to white publishers, giving them access to mainstream exposure. Emerging out of a burgeoning urban black middle class, the Harlem Renaissance also embraced theater, music, and a new political awareness. Although the Great Depression brought the movement to an end, it marked a significant step forward in self-respect for Black America, and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement after World War II. A defiant voice. Zora Neale Hurston was a Harlem Renaissance writer and a prominent figure in both African American and women's literature. Her best-known novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is about a poor black woman, Janie Crawford, in the southern states of the USA in the early 20th century. The story is bookended by her return to Eatonville, Florida, the USA's proud first all-black city, where Hurston herself grew up. Like other Harlem Renaissance texts, the novel differs from earlier works about African American life by being honest and realistic rather than overtly sentimental. Hurston's innovative use of the rural Southern black dialect is a notable feature of the text. The book also focuses on Janie's marriages to 3 husbands, each of whom dominates her life and undermines her status, and against whom she rebels. Their eyes were watching God is an early and defiant voice on several crucial issues that have lost none of their relevance or resonance in the modern world, notably racism, poverty, and gender inequality. See also, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Invisible Man Beloved. In context. Focus. Hard-boiled fiction before 1930. The Maltese Falcon, by U.S. author Dashiell Hammett, introduces the sleuth Sam Spade, whose strong ethical values were an inspiration for Chandler's Philip Marlowe. 1934. The Postman Always Rings Twice, by U.S. writer James M. Cain, gains notoriety for its sex and brutal violence. After 1943. Another novel by Cain, Double Indemnity, tackles the theme of a femme fatale plotting to kill her husband, in this case the motive being to claim on life insurance. 1953. In Chandler's The Long Goodbye, which has Marlowe as its hero, two characters, Roger Wade, a hard-drinking writer, and Terry Lennox, another alcoholic, are partly autobiographical. Hard-boiled detective fiction brought realism, sex, violence, and fast, colloquial dialogue to the crime genre. It began with the short story form, especially those stories published in the popular pulp magazines of the 1920s to 1940s, the leading exponent being Black Mask. Raymond Chandler's most illustrious predecessor was Dashiell Hammett, whose first hard-boiled detective story, Red Harvest, came out a decade before Chandler's The Big Sleep and was originally serialized in Black Mask. The hard-boiled detective, although clever, is a man of action. Battling organized crime and police corruption, he gets dragged into violence. Guns are among the hazards he faces, and in certain situations he needs to carry one, and sometimes use it. These experiences harden him into cynicism, hence the phrase, hard-boiled. Yet at the same time, he has his principles. Chandler's detective, Philip Marlowe, ordering a young woman to get dressed in The Big Sleep after refusing her advances, looks down at his chessboard and sees that he has made a mistake with a knight move. Knights, he says, have no meaning in this game. But they do. Marlowe, for all his faults, is a modern knight, among the kings and queens of crime and their pawns. He is loyal to clients, hates liars, cheats, and thugs, and fights back with wit and courage. Two intertwined plots linked by sexual attraction provide The Big Sleep with its storyline, revolving around an elderly ex-general's two wayward daughters, missing persons, blackmail, murder, and double crosses. The result is a complex but well-controlled tale. New uses for pulp. Part of Chandler's achievement was to apply literary sophistication to pulp fiction subjects. The Big Sleep is told by Marlowe in the first person, and the language is sharply idiomatic, colloquial not only in the dialogue but also the narration. But the prose has a jewel-like precision, with terse, beautifully crafted sentences. There are witty or amusingly exaggerated similes, such as doors, which would have led in a troop of Indian elephants, but they are not overdone. The story has a tight plot, with one situation flowing naturally into the next. Two-thirds of the way in, Marlowe has solved the mystery for his client. However, he spends the rest of the book tying up a loose end, and putting himself in further danger to discover how deep into evil an arch-villain has fallen. Throughout, Marlowe remains one step ahead of everybody else, and able, like the chess knight, to outwit his enemies by unexpected moves. The Big Sleep of the title is death, and is the subject of a poignant coda in which Marlowe, showing self-understanding far beyond Sherlock Holmes, implicates himself as part of the nastiness. Raymond Chandler. Born in Chicago, USA, in 1888, Raymond Chandler was taken to England at the age of 12 by his divorced mother. He was schooled at Dulwich College, South London, and later studied international law in France and Germany. Returning to the USA in 1912, he lived in California, working, among other jobs, as a tennis racket stringer. He joined the Canadian Army after World War I broke out, and served in France. In 1924 he married Cissy Pascal, a woman 18 years his senior. He started writing in earnest after losing his job at an oil company in the Great Depression. His first published story appeared in Black Mask magazine in 1933. The Big Sleep was his first novel. He went on to write 6 others. In 1959, the year before he died, he became president of the Mystery Writers of America. Other key works: 1940 Farewell, My Lovely, 1949 The Little Sister, 1953 The Long Goodbye. See also, Bleak House, The Moonstone, The Hound of the Baskervilles, The New York Trilogy. In context. Focus: writers in exile. Before 1932, the Austrian Jewish writer Joseph Roth writes the Radetzky March, which details Austria-Hungary's decline, a year before he leaves Germany for Paris. He remains in exile for the rest of his life. 1939, Bertolt Brecht's anti-war play Mother Courage and Her Children is written a few years after he flees Nazi persecution. 1941, published just before his suicide in Brazilian exile, Austrian author Stefan Zweig's novella The Royal Game criticizes the brutality of the Third Reich's Nazi regime. After 1952, Holocaust survivor Paul Celan produces a collection of poems, Poppy and Memory, after settling in Paris following horrific wartime experiences in his native Central Europe. Many writers were forced to flee their homelands before and during World War II, and a somber, wistful, and elegiac tone is often evident in the literature produced in exile by such writers, who include Joseph Roth, Bertolt Brecht, Stefan Zweig, and Paul Celan. Also among this exodus was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince in New York after he had left France, following its occupation by the Nazis. Like many of the great literary works from this era, The Little Prince is not strictly a war novel, but it is shaped by the political and social context that the war brought about. Saint-Exupéry's book has been read in numerous ways: as a general moral and philosophical fable, as a children's fairy tale, as an autobiographical story that has been reimagined as fantasy, and as a direct reflection of its times. These interpretations have all been made of other works of exile literature, which commonly lament a lost way of life. Here is my secret: very simply, you can only see things clearly with your heart. What is essential is invisible to the eye. The Little Prince. State of dislocation. Given its genesis in a time of displacement, it is not surprising that the title character of Saint-Exupéry's novel is an alien boy who falls to earth in the eerie landscape of the Sahara Desert. The narrator, a pilot who has crash-landed, encounters the boy there. Abandonment, wandering, escape, and instability characterize the narrative of The Little Prince, which presents us with a seemingly simple children's story. But like all good examples of such fiction, it is a tale for both old and young. Saint-Exupéry takes from classic children's literature the idea that the state of childhood is one of transition, where difference predominates. The prince is literally and metaphorically an alien wandering the earth, a child lost in an adult world. But as a character, his alienness is infused with a moral philosophy that celebrates dissimilarity and questions the world of adults, which has led to war, and, in Saint-Exupéry's case, exile from home. Like a child's painful maturation into the unknowable realm of adulthood, the state of exile is a process of losing and relearning one's place in the world. Tolerating difference. This strangeness of the adult world, coupled with the novel's celebration of the little prince's alienness, has also been read as a political critique. The baobab trees, which infest the home planet of the Little Prince, have been interpreted as a reference to the contemporary sickness of Nazism and its equally grasping nature as it moved across Europe, destroying all in its path, including Saint-Exupéry's beloved France. The narrator warns about some terrible seeds on the Little Prince's planet. And a baobab, if you tackle it too late, will bore right through a planet with its roots. In contrast, the novel positions the humanist philosophy of rationality, compassion, and respect for difference against this spreading disaster. The alien boy advises us all that eyes are blind. One must look with the heart. The Little Prince is a timeless yet timely exploration of the value of human life. Like other writers in exile, Saint-Exupéry explores loss and change against a backdrop of upheaval and alienation, which fosters kindness towards others and a toleration of difference. The rise of the Nazis saw the emergence of writer refugees whose homelands became hostile environments due to politics, antisemitism, and war. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Born to a French aristocratic family in 1900, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry had a strict upbringing in a chateau near Lyon. During his national service, he became an aviator. Before World War II, he was a commercial pilot who pioneered airmail routes in Europe, South America, and Africa. When war broke out, he joined the French Air Force and flew reconnaissance missions until 1940. During these years he produced many well-known works, but The Little Prince was not written until he and his wife, Consuelo Sunson, fled heartbroken into exile after France's defeat and its armistice with Germany. Vilified by his government and depressed by his stormy marriage, Saint-Exupéry flew his last flight in 1944, over the Mediterranean, where it is believed he was shot down. His posthumous reputation has recovered him as one of France's literary heroes. Other key works: 1926 The Aviator, 1931 Night Flight 1944 Letter to a Hostage. See also, Mother Courage and Her Children, Poppy and Memory, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Further reading: The Call of the Wild. Jack London. The masterpiece of the U.S. writer London, The Call of the Wild, a popular and unashamedly emotional tale of survival, is set during the 1890s Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska. The main character is a dog, half Saint Bernard, half collie, purloined from a California ranch and set to work as a sled dog in faraway Alaska. He suffers abuse by his owners and aggression from a rival dog before finally turning feral. Shedding civilization and relearning primitive ways, he becomes leader of a wolf pack. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fawn. The Call of the Wild. Jack London. Nostromo. Joseph Conrad. Poland-born novelist Conrad, a mariner for 20 years, took British citizenship in 1886 and wrote in English. Nostromo, subtitled A Tale of the Seaboard, is an analysis of politics, revolution, and corruption that plays out in a fictional Republic of South America, and an important examination of post-colonial global capitalism. Fused with these themes is a tale of adventure that traces the fortunes of the eponymous hero, a man of principle. This is a dark work, full of betrayal and disillusion. Much of the story, even the climax, is conveyed by flashbacks. Ethan Frome. Edith Wharton. The most popular work of U.S. author Wharton, Ethan Frome, is narrated by a visitor to a New England town who is intrigued by one of its residents, Ethan Frome, a dour and monosyllabic farmer. Switching from the first person to an extended third-person flashback, the novel tells the tragic tale of the secret love of Frome for his wife's cousin, and the tragic outcome of a snowy smash-up that occurred 24 years earlier. The themes of passion, thwarted emotions, resentment, and frustration are magnified against the harsh rustic environment. Death in Venice. Thomas Mann. The most famous novella by German Nobel laureate Mann, Death in Venice, is about a famous author suffering from writer's block, who takes a short holiday in the Italian city of the title, where he becomes obsessed by a 14-year-old boy. Cholera has been detected and there are health warnings in place, creating an atmosphere of dissolution. The book is a Freudian reflection on both the degenerative force of illicit homoerotic passion across the generations, and of the profound poignancy of aging. Sons and Lovers. D. H. Lawrence. A partly autobiographical exploration of the working-class family and romantic relationships, Sons and Lovers is often seen as Lawrence's finest work. Set in the mining region where Lawrence was brought up, the book tells the story of a young budding artist, Paul Morel, who has romantic involvements with an unyielding, religiously minded girlfriend and a married woman, both of whom are overshadowed by Paul's mother, with whom he shares a close, suffocating bond. Paul's father is violent and uneducated, which adds to family tensions. The book is an unsentimental portrait of childhood, adolescence, the clash between generations, and familial possessiveness and grief, set within a closely observed social setting. The mother's unfulfilled life and final fatal illness are poignantly depicted. D. H. Lawrence. Born in 1885, David Herbert Lawrence was the son of a coal miner and the first from his village in Nottinghamshire, England, to win a scholarship to the local high school. His early promise led to university and a teaching career, but his writing talent, his first story was published in 1907, persuaded him to quit teaching in 1912. He eloped to Germany with married aristocrat Frida Weekly in the same year. Marked by a spontaneous, vivid realism, Lawrence's writing subverted prevailing social, sexual, and cultural norms, earning him censorship and, at the time of his death in 1930, a tarnished reputation. Key works: 1913 Sons and Lovers, 1915 The Rainbow, 1920 Women in Love. In Search of Lost Time. Marcel Proust. Published in 7 volumes over 15 years, In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past, is the masterpiece of French writer Marcel Proust. In a famous early scene, the taste of a Madeleine cake releases memories of boyhood holidays for the first-person narrator. Proust's leisurely, analytical prose outlines detailed accounts of the inner lives of both himself and the characters of the work, including love and jealousy, homosexuality, artistic ambition, and many varieties of vice and virtue. The experience of living in wartime Paris is vividly conveyed. Throughout, social nuances are subtly registered. Eventually the narrator learns that the beauty of the past lives on in the memory, time is regained. He then sets about writing his life story. This autobiographical dimension is one of the work's many fascinations. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. James Joyce. The first novel by Irish writer Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, traces the early years of a character who would later reappear in Joyce's 1922 masterpiece, Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus rebels against the norms of Ireland and Catholicism, and sets out to forge his own destiny, as a writer in Paris. The book uses stream-of-consciousness narrative in a way that foreshadows the author's later work. The Heartless. Lee Kwang-soo. A South Korean journalist and independence activist, Lee Kwang-soo was the author of the first modern Korean novel, The Heartless. It tells the story of a young teacher of English in Seoul, torn between 2 women in the period of Japanese occupation. One is traditionalist and working as a kisaeng, the other is inclined to liberated Western values. The protagonist's predicament is used to dramatize social tensions in Korea, but the book also explores personal, sexual awakening as well as cultural ambiguities. Siddhartha. Hermann Hesse. Hugely popular in the 1960s due to its exploration of Eastern spirituality, Siddhartha by Swiss writer Hesse describes the spiritual life of a young Brahmin in ancient India. The title is Sanskrit, meaning, he who has attained his goals. The hero opts not to join the order newly created by the Buddha, but to discover his own form of insight. Sidetracked by wealth and erotic desire, he finally gains wisdom and love in the consciousness of the world's unimprovable completeness. The book fuses spiritual thinking with psychoanalysis and philosophy. A Passage to India. E. M. Forster. English author E. M. Forster sets a passage to India during the period of the British Raj in India, amid the stirrings of the movement for independence. The book's central event is an alleged and unspecified attempt at sexual impropriety in a cave complex, by a young Muslim Indian doctor against a British woman with whom he is on friendly terms. The case against the doctor, which leads to a trial, brings to the surface tensions between colonized and colonizing nations. Forster questions the underlying principles of British imperialism, in the process puncturing the romantic delusions of those seduced by the image of the British Raj. He also shows the marginalization of women in a milieu where male friendships are strong and mutually supportive. In England the moon had seemed dead and alien, here she was caught in the shawl of night together with Earth and all the other stars. A Passage to India. E. M. Forster. The Trial. Franz Kafka. Written in 1914-15, The Trial is the most complete of 3 unfinished novels by Jewish Czech writer Franz Kafka, who wrote in German. Its account of Joseph K., arrested and prosecuted by an inscrutable authority without being told the nature of his crime, has been interpreted as an archetypal metaphor for modern alienation, and for the dehumanizing effect of elaborate, inflexible bureaucracies, and, by extension, of totalitarian states. The latter interpretation makes Kafka a prescient author, anticipating fascism and Nazism. Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong he was arrested one fine morning. The Trial. Franz Kafka. Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway, written by Woolf when she was at the height of her powers, lays bare the consciousness of a well-to-do woman spending a day in London. Clarissa Dalloway's thoughts turn to a party she will be hosting that evening, but also range back in time, to her youth and the experience of her marriage to a reliable but unsatisfying man. The other major character is a traumatized soldier who spends time in the park with his Italian wife, before making a tragic decision. Technically, the novel is accomplished and original, shifting between direct and indirect speech, and juggling between omniscient narration, stream of consciousness, and soliloquy. Virginia Woolf. Foremost of the writers in the Bloomsbury set of influential intellectuals and artists, Woolf was born in 1882 in London. She started writing as a girl and her first novel, The Voyage Out, appeared in 1915. She married, happily, in 1912, but is also known for her love affair with talented gardener Vita Sackville-West. Woolf soon established herself as a leading intellectual and writer, taking fiction in a new direction, inwards. But she was prone to depression and mood swings. She committed suicide by drowning near Lewes, Sussex, in 1941, aged 59. Many feminist thinkers since her death have revered her as an inspiration. Key works: 1925 Mrs. Dalloway, 1927 To the Lighthouse, 1931 The Waves. The Counterfeiters. André Gide. Seen as a precursor to the 1950s Nouveau Roman novel form, The Counterfeiters by French author Gide draws a parallel between counterfeit gold coins and the authenticity of human feelings and relationships. Structured as a story within a story, the book is complicated by multiple plot lines and viewpoints in an attempt at a literary form of cubism, an art style in which the concept of a single point of perspective was abandoned. Centered around young men in fin de siècle Paris, one of the themes is the possibilities for fulfillment within homosexual relationships. Dona Barbara. Romulo Gallegos. Romulo Gallegos wrote Dona Barbara 2 decades before becoming the first democratically elected president of his native Venezuela. The novel, named after its charismatic female character, who exerts mysterious power over men, examines the tension between primitive and civilized impulses, and between the sexes. Set in the rural cattle ranching Llanos Prairie region, the story is told using evocative, vernacular language. There are magical realist elements that anticipate the fiction of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The Sound and the Fury. William Faulkner. An ambitious and enigmatic novel comprising 4 counterpoint perspectives, The Sound and the Fury is a masterpiece by Nobel laureate Faulkner, arch-chronicler of the U.S. South. The setting is Jefferson, Mississippi. The first section is a disjointed narrative told by Benji, a 33-year-old, cognitively disabled man. The second section is narrated by his older brother, a suicidal Harvard student 18 years earlier, the third, by Benji's hard-nosed younger brother, and the last section is narrated by one of the family's female black servants. Using stream of consciousness and radical time shifts, Faulkner creates a complex jigsaw of imagination and insight, and writes with an unparalleled understanding of race, grief, family dysfunction, and the decay of old Southern values. William Faulkner. An American Nobel Prize winner, Faulkner chronicled the South of his country. He was born in 1897, in New Albany, Mississippi. In 1902 his family moved to Oxford, Mississippi, where his father was business manager of the university. This was where Faulkner would spend most of his life, and the surrounding Lafayette County was the inspiration for his fictional Yoknapatawpha County, the setting for most of his novels. He first wrote poetry, and it was not until 1925 that he tackled a novel. He also trained in Canada as a pilot in the Royal Air Force. Faulkner's books often depict the decline of the upper echelons of society, addressing controversial themes such as slavery, but he also wrote about the poorer classes. He died in 1962, aged 64. Key works: 1929 The Sound and the Fury, 1930 As I Lay Dying, 1931 These 13, 1936 Absalom, Absalom. The Man Without Qualities. Robert Musil. Unfinished and written in 3 volumes, The Man Without Qualities was the life's work and masterpiece of Austrian novelist Musil. Eschewing plot-driven momentum, Musil presents a complex social vision and exposes modern values and political folly. Set in the twilight of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is satirized with heavy irony, the rambling story encompasses many characters in its more than 1,000 pages: a black page, an aristocrat, the murderer of a prostitute, and a hero who serves as a detached commentator on a collapsing society. Brave New World. Aldous Huxley. English writer Aldous Huxley presents in Brave New World, whose ironic title comes from a line in Shakespeare's The Tempest, a vision of a dystopian future, set in London around the year 2540. A world totalitarian state represses individual freedom and self-expression, including emotions. Genetic engineering and brainwashing are used as tools of control, and recreational drugs and sex are freely available. Consumerism is rampant, while spiritual values have shriveled to nothing. Even the terms mother and father are outlawed. A rebellious spirit, John the Savage, sets himself against the system and does battle with the world controllers. The book is admired for its prophetic insights as well as its moral outlook and vivid writing. Journey to the End of the Night. Louis Ferdinand Céline. Radically experimental in style and treatment, Journey to the End of the Night is a partly autobiographical novel by French writer Dr. Louis Ferdinand Auguste Destouches, who wrote under the pseudonym Céline, which was also his grandmother's first name. Characterized by black comedic invective, the mood is darkly pessimistic, even misanthropic. The story traces the protagonist Ferdinand Bardini's journeys from France at the start of World War I, via colonial Africa to the USA and back to Paris. Focusing on human stupidity, Céline has challenging things to say about war, empire, and the ruling classes. Tropic of Cancer. Henry Miller. Banned by censors for its explicit and deliberately shocking sexual content, Tropic of Cancer was the debut novel of U.S. writer Miller. A sprawling, plotless, semi-autobiographical masterpiece, it describes life and love at the extremes of existence in 1930s Paris. Publication in the USA and UK was delayed until censorship laws were overturned in the 1960s. The book inspired a new wave of writers, such as the U.S. Beat Generation. The Book of Disquiet. Fernando Pessoa. Described by Portuguese author Pessoa as a factless autobiography, The Book of Disquiet was only published 47 years after his death. A modernist masterpiece, it is a fluid, kaleidoscopic, and unfinished mosaic of fragments that combine glimpses of self-revelation with reveries and maxims of literary criticism and philosophy. Pessoa filtered his writing through the use of heteronyms, invented authorial personae, and this highly original book gives a spellbinding insight into the process. Although a study in loneliness and despair, the story has a brilliant inventiveness that makes it engaging. Of Mice and Men. John Steinbeck. Steinbeck's most popular book and widely praised at the time of its publication, Of Mice and Men, is set in 1930s California during the Great Depression. It follows two itinerant ranch workers whose dream is to have a small farm of their own. An incident involving a ranchowner's daughter propels the story into tragedy. Steinbeck's themes include the hardship of penury, our desperate wish for comfort in loneliness, and the way aggressive self-interest can flourish in the weak as well as the strong. Nausea. Jean-Paul Sartre. A major work of existentialism, Nausea was the first novel by French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was later awarded, but declined to accept, the 1964 Nobel Prize. In a seaside town, an introverted historian is captivated by the idea that his intellectual and spiritual freedoms are circumscribed by the objects and situations that impinge upon him. The consequence is nausea, which turns into a profound angst and self-loathing that undermine his sanity. He begins to feel that relationships are empty, the struggle to make sense of the world can only be conducted within himself. Eventually, the protagonist views reality's indifference to his life as liberating, since he is now free to create his own version of meaning, with all the responsibility it brings. The Grapes of Wrath. John Steinbeck. Like Of Mice and Men, Steinbeck's masterpiece The Grapes of Wrath is set in the 1930s during the Great Depression. It focuses on the suffering of the Jodes, an Oklahoma Dust Bowl family who drive a saloon car converted into a truck along Route 66 to California to find work. Like many other economic migrants, they flee drought, dispossession, and unpaid debts. This powerful novel, which conveys the resilience of the human spirit under stress through poetic prose and sharp characterization, publicized the exploitation of migrant workers in the USA during the 1930s and drew attention to the cause of social improvement. While the Jodes are imperfect, they gradually exhibit a capacity for empathy. The final scene features an act of great compassion by the family's teenage daughter, Rose of Sharon. John Steinbeck. A Nobel Prize winner, John Steinbeck explored in fiction the relationship between humankind and the land. Born in 1902 in Salinas, California, most of his stories were set in the central and southern regions of the state. He was the son of a library treasurer. He majored in English at Stanford University but left in 1925 without a degree. His first successes as a writer date from the early 1930s, and in 1940 he won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for The Grapes of Wrath. As well as writing fiction, Steinbeck served as a war reporter, covering World War II in 1943 and the Vietnam War in 1967. He returned to California in 1944 and concentrated on local themes in his fiction. He died in New York, where he was living at the time, in 1968, aged 66. Key works: 1937 Of Mice and Men, 1939 The Grapes of Wrath, 1952 East of Eden. Mother Courage and Her Children. Bertolt Brecht. An important anti-war play, Mother Courage and Her Children is set during the 30 Years' War of 1618-48, although its ramifications are contemporary with the time of the author, German poet, theater director, and playwright Bertolt Brecht. By presenting the central figure, Mother Courage, without sentimentality, Brecht focuses his audience's attention on issues and broad themes, discouraging any identification with character. The play shows his trademark estrangement effect, drawing attention to theatrical artifice through placard captions, bright lighting, and other effects. The Outsider. Albert Camus. French author, journalist, and philosopher Albert Camus denied that The Outsider is an existentialist novel, although its plot is saturated in the bleakness associated with this philosophy. In the book, a French Algerian, unmoved by his mother's funeral, later unfeelingly shoots dead an Arab, someone he has never met. Convicted and imprisoned, he appears to be indifferent to his deprivations. However, the incident does awaken some self-awareness. The story, told from his viewpoint, is an example of the literature of the absurd, focusing on our attempt to find meaning where none exists. My mother died today. Or maybe yesterday, I don't know. The Outsider, Albert Camus. The Fountainhead. Ayn Rand. A study of the triumph of individual artistic vision when confronted by traditionalist pressures to conform. The Fountainhead by Russia-born U.S. author Ayn Rand tells the story of a modernist architect, who is thought to have been based on Frank Lloyd Wright. The novel combines uncompromising ethical individualism with romantic realism. More than 7 years in writing, it became a rallying cry for the right-wing, anti-communist philosophy of objectivism, a movement that Rand herself founded, which was based on reason, freedom, and personal talent and achievement. Fictions. Jorge Luis Borges. An enigmatic short story collection, Fictions reveals Borges' ability to draw the reader into his fantastical, complex imagination with stories that are as enchanting as fairy tales. The 17 pieces are exuberant, yet finely controlled. The prose has jewel-like precision, while the characteristic tone is one of profound metaphysical anxiety. The first story revolves around an encyclopedia entry for a country that cannot be located. Other stories tell of the reviewing of a non-existent book that in the process brings it into being, an ancient society ruled by chance, the infinite library of Babel, and a person with perfect memory. Certain symbols that are used in the book, particularly the mirror and the labyrinth, later become Borges' trademarks. Jorge Luis Borges. The Argentinian writer Borges, known for his intellectually intriguing stories, is a major figure of Spanish-language literature. Born in Buenos Aires in 1899, as a teenager he traveled with his family to Europe, and studied French and German in Geneva. He returned to Argentina in 1921. In 1955 he became director of the National Library and professor of English literature in Buenos Aires. He went blind at the age of 55 but never learned Braille, which may have been a factor in his vivid symbolism. As well as fiction, he wrote poetry and essays. He died in Geneva in 1986. Key works: 1935 A Universal History of Infamy, 1944 Fictions, 1967 Book of Imaginary Beings, Animal Farm. George Orwell. Animal Farm shows that satirical allegory can be as effective as realism in revealing the evils of totalitarianism. English author Orwell uses a tale of talking animals to dramatize the communist politics of the Russian Revolution and Stalinism. The human owners of the farm are ousted in a coup orchestrated by the pigs, Napoleon and Snowball. Initial idealism falls prey to human weakness, and hypocrisy sets in. Entertaining yet chilling, this is one of the most influential political books of the 20th century. Introduction. In 1945, much of the world was reeling from 3 decades of turmoil, 2 cataclysmic world wars, separated by a global Great Depression. In what proved to be a short-lived period of hope, many people struggled to make sense of the destruction and rebuild a better world. But as old empires and powers declined, new ones arose, resulting in the clash of cultures between the West and the Communist Eastern Bloc. The following decades were dominated by this Cold War, and the ever-present danger of nuclear war. Aftermath of World War II. Literature in the post-war period was inevitably influenced by experiences of war. Jewish writers, and especially Holocaust survivors such as poet Paul Celan, attempted to come to terms with the horrors of the death camps. German authors, including Günter Grass, tackled the shameful legacy of Nazism. In Japan, a generation of writers examined the social and political changes following the nuclear attack on Hiroshima. The negative effects were also felt in those countries that had been victorious in war. In England, George Orwell, who was also a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, argued that the defeat of Nazism had not removed the threat of totalitarianism. In Animal Farm in 1984 he portrayed dystopian societies that darkly satirized Stalin's Soviet Russia, capturing the pessimistic mood of the Cold War. This mood was also felt keenly in France, where the experience of war and the existential threat of the nuclear bomb manifested itself as nihilism rather than cynicism. Instead of trying to find some sense in life, writers such as Paris-based Irishman Samuel Beckett, in his play Waiting for Godot, pointed out its absurdity, depicted with a grim humor. In addition to this theater of the absurd, black humor could be found in U.S. novels such as Joseph Heller's Catch-22. New voices. The unsettled atmosphere of the era after the war also inspired new, postmodern writing techniques which reflected this uncertainty. Narratives could be paradoxical, fragmented, or presented out of chronological order, often from multiple perspectives, or that of an unreliable narrator. These techniques, developed by European writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Günter Grass, were an inspiration to the new generation of South American authors, who were establishing a distinctive style. Among them were Julio Cortázar, whose experimental anti-novel Hopscotch subverted many literary conventions, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who popularized the style known as magic realism, inspired by the surreal short stories of Argentinian Jorge Luis Borges. New literary movements were also emerging elsewhere, as many countries, especially in Africa, achieved national independence from European colonial control. Foremost among these countries was Nigeria, where Chinua Achebe provided an indigenous voice to a people rebuilding their nation. In the USA, too, writers continued to assert their identity. As the civil rights movement gathered momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, African American authors such as Ralph Ellison described how black people were marginalized, while Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird looked at race from the perspective of someone from the Deep South. Social issues of all types also provided the subject matter for new journalism, the blend of fact and fiction pioneered by Lee's friend Truman Capote. Youth culture. Perhaps the most vociferous manifestation of post-war culture came with the younger generation, and was most noticeable in the USA. An anti-establishment youth culture emerged as a reaction against the older generation that had taken them into 2 world wars and had continued on an aggressive path with military involvement in Korea and Vietnam. These young people also reacted to Cold War uncertainties and the nuclear threat with hedonistic dissent. J. D. Salinger was one of the first to describe teenage angst and rebellion, followed by the writers of the Beat generation, whose work was inspired by the freedom of modern jazz and the brashness of rock and roll. Experimental writing by Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs pushed the boundaries not only of form, but also of content. Their sometimes explicitly sexual material resulted in legal action and bans on books in some places, before the more relaxed attitudes of the 1960s. In context. Focus dystopia. Before 1516 English humanist Sir Thomas More's Utopia first imagines an ideal society, and its opposite, a dystopia. 1924 Russian writer Yevgeny Zamyatin's We describes the one state, where people live for the collective good. 1932 In English writer Aldous Huxley's Brave New World individuality is suppressed. After 1953 In Fahrenheit 451 by U.S. novelist Ray Bradbury, books are banned and burned. 1962 English novelist Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange depicts a world full of violence. 1985 The Handmaid's Tale, by Canadian author Margaret Atwood, is set in a USA run by a totalitarian Christian regime. Dystopian literature is a genre that portrays the nightmarish vision of a society that is the polar opposite of a utopia. Ever since the appearance of Thomas More's Utopia in 1516, dystopias have been evoked over the centuries by a wide range of writers to focus on topics such as dictatorships, poverty, torture, the oppression of populations, and the control of people's minds. Authors use these dystopian worlds to explore central human concerns, creating visions of the possible consequences of things happening in ways that are unrestrained. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, for instance, sees a world run by a military regime, in which women have been stripped of their rights and are appreciated purely for their reproductive value. Turning points. Dystopias focus primarily on imagined futures, and often on the fear of what may arise from new technologies and social change. For example, in the 20th century, the threat posed by the destructive force of the atomic bomb and the scenario of dramatic climate change have both provided powerful sources for dystopias. George Orwell's 1984 is the best-known modern dystopia. Orwell's fear of rising Stalinism is the starting point for the novel. Although Orwell believed in a democratic socialism, he saw the emerging USSR, in which one political party had consolidated complete control, as anything but socialist. He had also witnessed the splintering of anti-Franco forces in the Spanish Civil War in 1936, when pro-Stalin communists turned on those who were supposed to be their allies. Orwell had already painted a bleak vision of such treachery in his novella Animal Farm. He also had a template of sorts for his new work, the world outlined by Russian writer Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, in which individual freedom no longer exists. 1984 depicts a totalitarian society manipulating its citizens through propaganda, flipping truths into lies for the sake of maintaining political power. This dystopian society is far darker, one without the hope that the revolution in Animal Farm had first promised, and one in which individual lives have become mere cogs in an overarching system. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. 1984. The End of History. 1984's opening words, "It was a bright cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13, alert the reader to the fact that even the very nature of the day's temporal construction has shifted." Winston Smith, the novel's protagonist, is entering his apartment building. He is a citizen of London, capital of Airstrip 1, a province of Oceania, one of the 3 cross-continental states that exist following a global nuclear war. Posters fill the wall space with the image of a face, a man of about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features, and whose eyes follow you about when you move. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. Big Brother is the leader of the party that governs Oceania. The world Smith inhabits is ruled by an elite. The masses, who make up 85% of the population, are controlled by 4 paradoxical ministries: the Ministry of Peace, which oversees war; the Ministry of Love, which deals with policing; the Ministry of Plenty, which controls the economy, including rationing for the population; and the Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True, which deals with news and the education of the masses, issuing propaganda to control the thoughts of the people. One of the chief conduits of control is Newspeak, the language of the Ministry of Truth, which dictates the truth of the past as well as the present. History is revised and rewritten to fit the changing diktats of the state. And Winston Smith himself works in the Ministry of Truth, editing historical records, and burning the original documentation by posting it into a memory hole. History, as the reader understands it, has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. The role of the Ministry of Truth is to intimidate and terrify the population into compliance. Orwell describes the ministry's building as an enormous pyramidal structure, upon which is written the three slogans of the party. The all-seeing government. A network of telescreens, cameras, and covert microphones operate to spy and eavesdrop on the population. These are run by the thought police, who supervise the protection of the ruling party. Newspeak is a sinister, curtailed form of everyday English devised by the all-powerful state. In time, Old Speak will be replaced by Newspeak, a stark, simple language, purified to express meanings and to meet the ideological needs of Ingsoc or English socialism. Because thought requires words, the state will have inhibited thought crimes, and personal ideas and feelings of dissent will have become unthinkable. Everyman's rebellion. Orwell immerses his readers in this hideous totalitarian world before revealing that Winston Smith is engaged in a vital act of rebellion. In his tiny flat, dominated by the instrument of party control, Smith is starting to write his own history in a diary he has acquired secondhand, a crime of self-expression. He knows it will be an act that he cannot ever step back from and, moreover, that he was a lonely ghost uttering a truth that nobody would ever hear. And yet he continues to write. Winston Smith is the everyman hero of the novel, his surname's commonality suggesting that there is nothing special or unusual about him. That quality makes his act of subversion so incendiary. If every Smith or Jones were to rise up against society, then revolution would follow. The use of a name that feels ordinarily English echoes Eric Blair's own adoption of the pseudonym George Orwell, which he did shortly before publication of his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, to avoid any embarrassment to his family. Orwell's characterization of the ordinary Smith as a rebel, one who makes his own stand for genuine truth against the machinery of the party, creates an unlikely champion. In Julia, he finds a fellow dissenter and a lover. Younger than Smith, Julia is an apparent firebrand for the Junior Anti-Sex League, but passes Smith a note with the simple message, "I love you." Their affair is an act of rebellion itself, a sex crime. Yet their covert love cannot last for long, hidden beneath the facade of their obedience to Big Brother and the rules of Oceania. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. 1984. Enemies of the state. The state's acknowledged enemy is Emmanuel Goldstein, the party's former leader who now heads a resistance movement called the Brotherhood. Goldstein is a despised figure who is used to unite the citizenship of Oceania via the daily ritual act of 2 minutes hate, during which abuse is flung at Goldstein's image on the telescreens. In a second-hand bookshop, Smith opens a text, with no name or title on the cover. The book is The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein. Orwell inserts full pages from this book into the text of 1984 to draw the reader closer to the rebel protagonist and to reveal the political philosophies and social theories that have led to the present. This book within a book thus serves as a device to fill in some of the background, explaining the establishment of Oceania and the other superstates, Eurasia and Eastasia, in the global reorganization following World War II, and to expose the truth that each superstate has a similar ideological construct based on keeping their population compliant. The persuasiveness of the passages from Goldstein's book reveal the seductive power of words and language. One of 1984's greatest legacies is the plethora of words and phrases that have seeped from Newspeak into English. Big Brother, sex crime, thought crime, and Room 101 are just a handful of the most common linguistic creations found in Orwell's work. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever. 1984. Mastering manipulation. The ways in which the state can manipulate and control its citizens are key themes of 1984. In a totalitarian system, individual choices and lifestyles largely become the dictates of an overarching body of governance. Oceania's ruling organization shows that it is determined to maintain its grip on power by weakening personal relationships and eradicating trust and mutuality. Orwell traces the psychological and physical methods by which the state can coerce, either covertly or overtly, and try to crush human feelings and break a person's spirit. As Julia remarks, everybody always confesses. You can't help it. The experience of Winston Smith reveals how the state apparatus acts on a single, human individual, making the reader not only feel his pain but also his burning desire to fight back against the machine in whatever ways he can. A Soviet poster depicts Stalin as the revered leader. Orwell's dystopia was shaped by his experience in Spain, where the Stalinist faction was ruthless in its pursuit of total control. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself. 1984. A modern message. Initial critical reception of 1984 was extremely positive, referencing the originality of the bleak vision. Since then, the text has reached across the globe, been translated into some 65 languages, and found new audiences in a major film version directed by Michael Radford and released in 1984, with John Hurt playing Winston Smith. The central concern at the heart of the dystopia depicted in 1984 is the danger of allowing those who rule us to gain too much control. In a globalized modern era of mass surveillance, Orwell's warning resonates more than ever. George Orwell. George Orwell was born as Eric Arthur Blair in India in 1903 to British parents. He was schooled in England before heading back to the East, to enroll with the Indian Imperial Police in Burma. In 1928, he moved to Paris, returning to London in 1929 to write Down and Out in Paris and London. In 1936, Orwell traveled to Wigan, northern England, to experience the poverty forged by the Depression. That same year he married Eileen O'Shaughnessy before going to fight in Spain's Civil War and getting shot through the throat. Orwell returned to England in 1937 and in 1941 he joined the BBC, only to resign in 1943. He returned to writing with Animal Farm, which proved an immediate success. His wife died unexpectedly that same year, and Orwell isolated himself on Jura, a Scottish isle, where he wrote 1984. He died of tuberculosis in 1950, aged 46. Other key works. 1934 Burmese Days and 1937 The Road to Wigan Pier. 1938 Homage to Catalonia. See also, Candide Gulliver's Travels Brave New World Fahrenheit 451 Lord of the Flies A Clockwork Orange The Death of Artemio Cruz The Handmaid's Tale. In context. Focus. Birth of the Teenager Before 1774 The Sorrows of Young Werther, by German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, follows the passions of a sensitive young artist. 1821 English poet John Keats dies, aged 25. His early verse is criticized as adolescent. 1916 Irish writer James Joyce publishes a portrait of the artist as a young man, a coming-of-age novel that depicts rebellion and anti-Catholic sentiment. After 1963 U.S. writer Sylvia Plath publishes The Bell Jar, a coming-of-age story with a twist. Its teenage protagonist descends into madness. 1982 In Ham on Rye, by U.S. author Charles Bukowski, the first-person male narrator remembers his teen years. Numerous authors, from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and John Keats to James Joyce and F. Scott Fitzgerald, explored the precarious state of adolescence long before the birth of the teenager in 1950s America. Teenagers, though, with their wild new music and their thrill-seeking, represented a challenge to conservative society and culture, and were treated with nervous dismissal. Adults considered this generation to be morally lax and directionless. Teenagers kicked back with assertions of hypocrisy, considering themselves outsiders in an uncaring world, and this is the territory of Salinger's writing. The Catcher in the Rye is narrated by 17-year-old Holden Caulfield. He is liberal with his parents' money, and relentless in his commentary on the human condition, sexuality, and morality. He has little regard for authority and seems careless about his self-destructive trajectory. I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life. It's awful. The Catcher in the Rye. Teenage disaffection. But Holden Caulfield is much more than a teenage rebel. His frank admissions of deceptions, imperfections, and contradictions reveal a bemused individual who is hankering after childhood innocence, suffering grief, and growing painfully aware of the contradictions of adult life. He is a compelling antihero, an ambivalent, vulnerable figure, who can be sensitive and witty as well as immature and vulgar. Caulfield's casual disregard for honesty and disdain for societal norms are mitigated by a genuine confessional impulse and surprising tolerance for some of the diverse characters he encounters throughout the course of the novel. Caulfield is also an easy victim. He is bullied in his dormitory at school, and ripped off by a pimp working the elevator in the New York hotel. In his confusion about women and sex, he unconsciously seeks out kindness and familiarity. Having paid for a prostitute, he asks if they can simply talk. He strikes up a conversation with two nuns, despite his atheism, and they insist he is a very sweet boy. Inevitably, Salinger's dirty realism caused controversy. Some critics dismissed the novel as puerile and maudlin. But Salinger gained cult status in the years following its publication, further fueled by his reclusive lifestyle. Death and grief are prevailing themes in The Catcher in the Rye. After Holden's brother dies, he smashes his hands in rage, his classmate is bullied and comes to a tragic end, and the very title of the book refers to stopping. Children running through fields before they fall off a cliff. It is likely that the loss of numerous young soldiers in World War II influenced Salinger to write this compelling first-person narrative, which remains an enduring portrait of the teenager in crisis. J. D. Salinger. Jerome David Salinger was born in 1919 to wealthy parents in New York City. Like his main protagonist Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger attended several schools before graduating. After spending a year in Europe, he studied at Columbia University, taking a writing course led by Whit Burnett, editor of Story magazine, who became his mentor early in his writing career. Salinger was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1942 and continued to write despite suffering from a nervous condition. The Catcher in the Rye thrust Salinger onto the world stage as a literary celebrity. However, he resented the attention and became reclusive and far less productive. By the time of his death in 2010, The Catcher in the Rye remained Salinger's only full-length novel. Other key works: 1953 9 Stories. 1955 Raise High the Roof Beam, Carpenter's 1959 Seymour, An Introduction. 1961 Franny and Zoe. See also, The Sorrows of Young Werther, The Magic Mountain, a portrait of the artist as a young man, The Bell Jar. In context. Focus. Literature after Auschwitz before. 1947 In her poetry collection In den Wohnungen des Todes Berliner Nelly Sachs describes her own sufferings and those of the European Jews. 1947 Italian writer Primo Levi's If This Is a Man is a first-hand account of his incarceration in Auschwitz. 1949 German sociologist Theodor Adorno says that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, a condemnation not of the right to expression but of the society that had allowed Auschwitz to happen. After 1971 The Nazi and the Barber, a novel by German Holocaust survivor Edgar Hilsenrath, adopts the perspective of an SS officer who assumes a Jewish identity to escape prosecution. After the World War II concentration camp of Auschwitz was liberated on January 27, 1945, and the scale of the atrocities of the Jewish Holocaust became known, some thought the events so horrific that conventional bounds of literature would be unfit to describe them. To Jewish authors, however, some form of expression was essential. A mournful heritage. The poet Paul Celan was born Paul Anschel into a family of German-speaking Jews in Romania. He survived a ghetto and an internment camp to become, under the pen name Celan, a major post-war German-language poet. But, haunted by his experiences, he eventually committed suicide. Poppy and Memory, which contains more than 50 poems, was Celan's second collection and established his reputation. It includes his most famous poem, Toad's Fuge. Written in a musical rhythm, the poem features death, in the guise of the camp commandant, making prisoners dance by their own graves. The collection also includes another of his best-known poems, Corona, which has been read as a reflection on the attempt to achieve true love without it becoming an escape from the truth of the world. Elsewhere in Poppy and Memory, haunting images of the Holocaust recur: ash, hair, smoke, mold, bitterness, shadows, death, memory, and forgetting. In exploring these themes, Celan expresses the mournful heritage of organized mass murder. Black milk of morning we drink you at night. Toad's Fuge. See also, The Little Prince, The Tin Drum, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Death of a Naturalist. In context. Focus. The civil rights movement before 1940. Richard Wright's Native Son discusses the criminal roles that white society creates for African Americans. 1950. African American writer Gwendolyn Brooks wins the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry with her collection Annie Allen. It charts a woman's move from individual freedom to more engaged ideas of progress. After 1953. In Go Tell It on the Mountain, James Baldwin reflects on his own life and involvement with the church as an African American, showing both its positive side and its oppressive hold. 1969. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings expresses the author's changing responses to the violence of racism. The African American civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s sought to end racial segregation and discrimination in the USA through protest and civil disobedience. Authors such as James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison engaged with the movement, writing about the systematic disenfranchisement, overt racial discrimination, and state-sanctioned violence that pervaded the USA. An isolated activist. Born in Oklahoma in 1914, Ralph Ellison first studied music at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, but later moved to New York to pursue courses in the visual arts. Here, he met Richard Wright and was influenced both by his writing and his communist affiliations. Following service in the Merchant Navy in World War II, Ellison became disillusioned with left-wing ideology and began writing Invisible Man, a book concerned with political and social protest. Ellison found a new form for the protest novel, removed from earlier realist and naturalist works. His style was idiosyncratic, both in structure and narrative. Describing events based on his experience of being a black man, and what that meant in a personal and public perspective in U.S. society. The book's narrator is invisible, unnamed, and completely alone. Society chooses either not to see him, or to ignore him. He lives underground, mirroring the segregation of African Americans at the time. In his isolation, the narrator reflects passionately on the path his life has taken, from public speaker in his youth, to disgraced college student and mistreated worker in a white factory in Harlem, to involvement with the politically ambiguous Brotherhood. The narrator muses over the injustices he has suffered in life, but finally he concludes that he must live a life that is true to his nature and his wider responsibilities. He is ready to emerge into the world. See also, Les Miserables. Their eyes were watching God. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. In context. Focus. Banned books. Before 1532, 64. François Rabelais. Gargantua and Pantagruel is condemned for obscenity by the College of Sorbonne, Paris. 1759. Although banned by government and church authorities for its satirical content, Voltaire's Candide becomes a bestseller. 1934. Tropic of Cancer. Henry Miller's account of life as a writer in Paris, is banned in the USA for sexual content. After 1959. Narrated by a junkie, William Burroughs's Naked Lunch is banned in Boston in 1962. The decision is overturned in 1966. 1988. Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses is banned in more than 10 countries for perceived blasphemy against Islam. Literary history is punctuated with books that were either banned or censored because they were thought to corrupt public morals or cause political or religious offense. In the first half of the 20th century, literary experimentation pushed the boundaries of taste and shocked a conservative audience. In response to this, censors trawled through works such as Irish writer James Joyce's Ulysses to identify obscenities, and removed sexual references from English author D. H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. But after the unexpurgated Lady Chatterley was tried on grounds of obscenity in 1960 and acquitted, restrictions on the publication of pornographic literature in the UK were effectively abandoned. Across the world, book censorship eased, but it never disappeared entirely. Accepting the unacceptable. Few now would be offended by books that were censored in the past, and yet Vladimir Nabokov's controversial novel Lolita retains its power to disturb as well as enchant. Banned after its 1955 publication in France and republished in London in 1959, the novel is founded on narrator Humbert Humbert's obsession with a certain type of underage seductress, the Nymphet, a slender, silky-skinned pubescent girl, aged between 9 and 14 years. The title of the novel has become part of the English language as a reference to a young temptress. Reading Lolita creates a state of mental confusion as the reader warms to a narrator who subverts all normal reactions to his appalling story. In Humbert's claustrophobic fantasy, readers lose perspective, seduced by an urbane European professor, with a well-prepared defense peppered with apologies, literary allusions, wordplay, and treacherous wit. The spell of obsession. As an adolescent on the French Riviera, Humbert fell in love with the young Annabelle, the template for his obsession. Years later, in the USA, he broke her spell by incarnating her in another, Dolores Hayes, dubbed Lolita, the 12-year-old daughter of his landlady. The devastating consequences are played out after Humbert marries the mother to gain access to the girl, the object of his fantasy. A vague plan to murder his new wife becomes unnecessary after she is mown down by a car. The bereaved stepfather then collects Dolores from summer camp and begins his attempt to live out his dream. Literature is often perceived as a threat by authorities because of its ability to convey ideas that have the potential to change minds and challenge prevailing ideologies. Some surprising titles have been banned over the years by nations, states, or libraries for their political content, sexual explicitness, and offensiveness to religion. In Love with Language. In an erotic novel that offers almost nothing salacious, Part 2 is a continuation of the author's real love affair with language. In his highly wrought, ornate, and lyrical prose, Humbert pieces together his year-long road trip with Dolores across the continent, putting the geography of the United States into motion. The details of his despotic infatuation intermittently surface in a surreal, cinematic account that spools across page after page of wry observation on U.S. culture. Arriving back on the East Coast after a year, Humbert enrolls Dolores at school, and the fabric of his fantasy begins to fall apart. Style, structure, and imagery are not found in pornographic books, as Nabokov reminds us in a defensive afterword to a novel that excels on all three counts. Humbert is the ultimate unreliable narrator, shielded by a fictional forward writer who wraps up the loose ends before the story has even begun. There are no alternative accounts, only the posthumous voice of Humbert, defending the indefensible to his readers. Vladimir Nabokov. Born into an aristocratic family in St. Petersburg, in April 1899, Vladimir Nabokov spent his childhood in Russia and grew up trilingual in English, French, and Russian. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the family was exiled to England in 1919, where Nabokov studied at Trinity College, Cambridge. Following a further move to Berlin, Nabokov's father, a journalist and politician, was assassinated at a political rally. Living in Berlin and in Paris, Nabokov wrote novels, short stories, and poems in Russian, while working as a tennis coach and tutor. He married Vera Slonim in 1925. They had one son, Dmitry. After fleeing to the USA during World War II, Nabokov wrote Lolita in English. He taught at Wellesley College and Cornell University and, as an authority on butterflies, held a position at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. He died in Montreux, Switzerland, in 1977. Other key works. 1937 The Gift. 1962 Pale Fire. See also, Gargantua and Pantagruel Madame Bovary Ulysses 1984 The Tin Drum Howl and Other Poems American Psycho The Satanic Verses. In context. Focus the absurd. Before. 1942 The narrator of Albert Camus' novel The Outsider expresses a typical absurdist belief: I laid my heart open to the gentle indifference of the universe. After 1959 Les Nègres, a play by French writer Jean Genet, shocks audiences by using black actors whited up. 1959 In Rhinoceros by Romanian playwright Eugene Ionescu, characters turn into rhinoceroses and wreak havoc, indicating the absurdity of a world where ordinary people change into fascist monsters. 1960 English writer Harold Pinter's play The Caretaker owes a great debt to Beckett in its lack of plot and its oblique dialogue, full of tangents and offbeat implications. The Theatre of the Absurd, in which the acclaimed Irish writer Samuel Beckett played a major role, subverted the norms of art and life by entertaining the idea that any meaning in the universe would always elude our attempts to discover it. He leaves no stone unturned, said English playwright Harold Pinter admiringly of Beckett, and no maggot lonely. In both his plays and his fiction, Beckett gave voice to the inarticulate, damaged souls, without hope and with only pathetic consolations, facing the brute truths of existence. Words in Orbit. The play Waiting for Godot features two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon. Their dialogue is a tragicomic dance of ideas, and the action defies common sense. Another character, Lucky, led on a rope by his master, Pozo, says nothing initially but later spews out a surreal 700-word unpunctuated monologue with phrases that have no meaning. The speech stops only when Vladimir pulls off Lucky's hat, causing him to break off mid-sentence, an example of Beckett's debt to vaudeville comedy and, more specifically, to comedians Laurel and Hardy. The tramps are waiting for Godot, but this character never turns up, and has been seen as a stand-in for God, often referred to but also absent, an analysis that irritated Beckett, although he conceded its plausibility. Joyce was a synthesizer, trying to bring in as much as he could. I am an analyzer, trying to leave out as much as I can. Samuel Beckett. See also, Metamorphosis, The Trial, Nausea, The Outsider. In context. Focus. Post-war Japanese writers before 1946 Haruo Omizaki's collection of short stories Sakurajima is published. The tales, which made his name, touch on aspects of Japanese life in World War II, such as kamikaze pilots. 1951 Shoei Oka's most famous novel, Fires on the Plain, is published. Like Omizaki's Sakurajima, it reflects the author's wartime experiences, including Japan's defeat by U.S. forces on Leyte Island in the Philippines. After 1962 Kobo Abe's novel The Woman in the Dunes is a bleak and disturbing tale about an amateur entomologist who is held captive in an escape-proof shack at the bottom of a pit of sand in a remote village. In the decades leading up to World War II, Japan was an aggressive military state, occupying parts of China. Its strict code of literary censorship tightened even further during wartime. The relaxing of these restrictions at the end of the war saw a flowering of literary voices. Freedom and diversity. Many of the first generation of post-war writers focused on the subject of wartime experiences. However, with the appearance of a second generation, and a third, the only theme that united the authors was the freedom that allowed them to flourish. This resulted in a period of intense creativity and productivity. Yukio Mishima was of the second generation, and The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is often said to be his finest work. It tells the fact-based story of an ugly, stuttering young monk who comes to hate all beauty, especially the 550-year-old Zen temple in Kyoto, decorated in gold leaf. Initially, it represents to the monk the transitory nature of life and beauty, but comes to dominate his thoughts as a bullying presence, and one that he cannot escape. The novel was extremely popular, a compelling study of madness that leads to destruction, but also a meditation on beauty itself, of which one of the most beautiful aspects is Mishima's prose. It is no exaggeration to say that the first real problem I faced in my life was that of beauty. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. See also, The Love Suicides at Sonozaki. In context. Focus. The Beat Generation before 1926 Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises depicts modern Americans traveling through Europe on a quasi-spiritual journey. 1952 John Cleland Holmes's novel Go includes the first use of the term beat to define the people of the beat movement. 1953 Lawrence Ferlinghetti opens City Lights Bookshop in San Francisco. It becomes a haunt for the beat writers. 1956 Allen Ginsberg's first collection of poetry Howl and Other Poems is published, launching him as the leading beat poet. After 1959 William S. Burroughs' A Naked Lunch uses a radically disjointed, nonlinear style extending the narrative form of the beat generation. In the post-war United States, a generation of middle-class youth became increasingly reluctant to follow the societal pathways of their parents based on materialistic goals. Instead, they adopted a meandering, spontaneous form of existence in their quest to find true meaning in life. Some of them became known as Beats, a collective of poets and writers who sought kicks, spiritual refuge, and excess in drink, drugs, and sex. They also delighted in jazz. The term beat simultaneously held notions of being beatific, of being beaten by the punishing intensity of a hobo existence, and of a life lived to a jazz beat. In the 1950s, tales of the beat movement's free lifestyle and reckless ways shocked mainstream society, and their writings signaled a radical reinvigoration of U.S. literature. The appearance of Jack Kerouac's novel, On the Road, in 1957 framed him as the leading beat novelist. On the Road details a series of journeys that Kerouac took between 1947 and 1950. In the book they are narrated by Sal Paradise, who is often accompanied on his travels by Dean Moriarty. A number of other Beat generation writers also appear in the book, disguised by name only, such as Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs. The book has 5 parts. The first sees Sal Paradise setting off for San Francisco in July 1947. Sal meets Dean Moriarty and the two launch on a riotous road trip, hitchhiking and riding buses on a meandering adventure, partying, meeting friends, and looking for girls before finally returning to New York. The subsequent parts tell of a series of hedonistic charges through North America. Spontaneous prose. The narrative form of On the Road, which Kerouac referred to as spontaneous prose, was inspired by an 18-page typed letter that he received in December 1950 from his friend Neal Cassady. According to Kerouac, the key to the prose was to write swiftly and without consciousness, in a semi-trance, allowing the mind to flow freely, associating sights, sounds, and senses in a narrative of absolute immediacy. For example, as Sal and Dean reach Chicago, Kerouac writes screeching trolleys, newsboys, gals cutting by, the smell of fried food and beer in the air, neons winking, we're in the big town, Sal. Ho! The long, fluid, descriptive sentences and stream of consciousness style mirrored the intensive pace of Sal's alcohol-infused, vagrant existence, while imitating the improvisational character of jazz music. Kerouac wrote On the Road in a frenetic 3-week period in April 1951, fueled by caffeine and drugs. The result was a manuscript in wildly creative, original prose, or spontaneous bop prosody, as Ginsberg called it, that came to define the beat generation. Kerouac typed On the Road onto rolls of tracing paper that he had glued together to avoid having to change paper and interrupt his creative flow. The final manuscript was 120 foot long. Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac was born to French-Canadian parents in Lowell, Massachusetts, USA, in 1922. He attended Columbia University where he met Allen Ginsberg, Neal Cassady, and William S. Burroughs, who would become fellow leading lights of the beat generation. Kerouac dropped out of university in his second year, then joined the Merchant Navy, before turning to writing as a profession. From 1947, he became increasingly attracted to the whiskey-drinking hobo lifestyle and began wandering across the USA and Mexico, often visiting various other beat writers. Those voyages across the North American landscape were relayed in his various Roman à clef writings, friends' faces only thinly veiled as protagonists. Kerouac's alcoholism led to cirrhosis and his death in 1969. Other key works: 1950 The Town and the City, 1957 On the Road, 1958 The Subterraneans, 1958 The Dharma Bums, 1972 Visions of Cody. See also The Red Room, The Catcher in the Rye, Howl and Other Poems, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. In context. Focus Nigerian voices. Before 1952, Amos Tutwola tells a Yoruba folklore story in English in The Palm Wine Drinkard. 1954, Cyprian Ekwensi gains international attention with people of the city. After 1960, Wola Soyinka's play A Dance of the Forests critiques present-day corruption through the nation's mythological past. 2002, Helen Habila depicts a new generation living in Lagos under a military regime in Waiting for an Angel. 2006, Half of a Yellow Sun, set during the Biafran War, confirms Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie as an exceptional new voice and wins the 2007 Orange Prize for Fiction. Published in 1958, Chinua Achebe's slim volume of less than 150 pages, Things Fall Apart, is one of the earliest novels to offer a mode of expression to indigenous writers in Nigeria, and was an instrument in the formation of a dazzling canon of literature. This multi-layered story of a fictionalized tribal village and its cataclysmic contact with British colonizers in the late 19th century has since become the world's most widely read African novel, selling more than 12 million copies in over 50 languages. The story told in Things Fall Apart has a resonance for all of the world's traditional cultures torn apart by invasion. The novel's title is taken from W. B. Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, which was written in the aftermath of World War I. Yeats's apocalyptic imagery of the world caught up in anarchy, and the arrival of an ambiguous messiah, some unformed, slouching beast, presages the novel's first coming of white Christian colonizers who invade and break apart tribal cultures. The Igbo people celebrate different festivals throughout the year. In Things Fall Apart, the Feast of the New Yam is held just before the yam harvest to give thanks to the earth goddess, Ani. Nigerian reality. Early in Things Fall Apart, we learn that, among the Igbo, the art of conversation is regarded very highly, and proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. Perhaps it is unsurprising that some of the villagers of Umuofia are won over by the colonizers' hymns and Bible stories. Achebe wins over his audience in much the same way, drawing readers into a classic novel with a three-part structure, compelling plot, and tragic hero, but infused with the myths and oral tradition of Nigerian culture. When Achebe published his pivotal work, Nigeria was in a state of political flux in the lead-up to independence in 1960. He wrote the novel partly as a response to the representation of Africa in the books he studied at college. In 2000, he described how Anglo-Irish writer Joyce Carey's novel Mr. Johnson, set in Nigeria, was held up as a fine example of writing about Africa, although native Nigerians saw in it an undercurrent of distaste and mockery. He also maintained that Joseph Conrad's lurid description of natives in Heart of Darkness typified the racism endemic in literature about Africa shown by European writers. Achebe's reply was to write a textured, immersive story of the downfall of a traditional society, a rich, close community of Igbo people. In place of Conrad's indistinguishable hordes of black savages, Achebe peoples his village of Umuofia with vibrant characters that leap from the page. Set in pre-colonial southern Nigeria in the 1890s, Things Fall Apart portrays a civilized society that has rich traditions of culture, commerce, religion, and justice. The people's social courtesies and greetings, such as the breaking and sharing of kola nuts, the bargaining of terms of betrothal, and the importance of women's chastity and obedience in this patriarchal society would not seem out of place in a Jane Austen novel. In Umuofia, life revolves around the seasons as villagers plant, tend, and harvest the crop of yams, observe the Week of Peace, and enjoy celebrations marked with palm wine feasts, wrestling matches, storytelling, and songs. A self-made man. The protagonist, Okonkwo, is a famous wrestler and warrior, a quick-to-anger husband of 3 wives, and the proud owner of a large compound. Having inherited nothing from his idle, cowardly, and indebted father, whom he strives to resemble as little as possible, Okonkwo works the fields as a sharecropper to become wealthy, building up the storehouses of yams and coffers of cowries that signify prosperity. His second wife, Ekwifi, is a tribal beauty who leaves her first husband because of her passion for Okonkwo. Their only child, Ezinma, is a spirited tomboy with such an understanding of her father and the subtleties of village life that Okonkwo concludes more than once that she should have been born a boy. European colonizers saw Africans as primitive, making little attempt to understand their customs and cultures. The imposition of alien values and institutions led to profound transformations in traditional African communities at all levels. The white man is very clever. He has put a knife on things that held us together and we have fallen apart. Things fall apart. Questions and answers. In Igbo culture, the wishes of the gods are passed on by Igwugwu, masked village elders representing the clan's ancestral spirits, and include brutal acts of sacrifice. These will become the crack in their culture that allows ingress and collapse. This may be the land of the living. Not far removed from the domain of the ancestors, but there are few who adhere as slavishly to the murderous will of the gods as Okonkwo. His warrior ideology begins to set him apart from others who are starting to ask questions even before the white men arrive. Ekwefi resolves to defend her daughter from the gods. Obiorika, Okonkwo's friend, questions the practice of abandoning twins at birth, but although he thought for a long time he found no answer. The first white man to arrive in the neighboring village of Mbanta supplies an answer. He tells the tribe that they worship gods of deceit who tell you to kill your fellows and destroy innocent children. There is only one true God. As the missionary's converted interpreter struggles to explain to the crowd about Yesu Christi, the Son of God, Okonkwo asks if God also has a wife. The missionary plows on with an incomprehensible account of the Holy Trinity, which seems to be little different from the multiple gods of the Igbo tribes, and just as reliant on blind faith. Masks were worn by Igbo men for magical purposes during certain rituals, especially at funerals and festivals, or, as in Things Fall Apart, by the Igwugwu to administer justice. Two sides of the story. Achebe exposes the brutality of colonization, including massacres and imprisonments, but also describes the work of Mr. Brown, a gentle missionary, who listens as well as preaches, winning hearts and minds by combining religion with education, gifts, and medicine. Okonkwo's eldest son, Nwoi, is among those of the tribe who are drawn to the poetry of the new religion and moved by the gay and rollicking tunes of evangelism. For Nwoi, Christian hymns not only have the power to pluck at the silent and dusty chords in the heart of an Igbo man, but seem to answer a vague and persistent question that haunted his young soul. The power of language. Asked why he chose to write in English rather than his native Igbo, Achebe replied that it would be foolish not to use a language he had spent a lifetime acquiring and one that could be put to active use as a counterargument to colonization. Achebe maintained that written Igbo, devised by the missionaries at the turn of the century, was a mix of dialects that had lost all the rhythm and music of the spoken language. The point is illustrated in his novel when the white man's Igbo interpreter is mocked by the local villagers for his different dialect. His way of saying myself translates as my buttocks. Achebe followed Things Fall Apart with two novels that form a trilogy built around the country's turbulent half-century under British rule. No Longer at Ease, set in the period just before Nigeria gained independence, tells the story of Okonkwo's grandson Obi, who returns from university abroad and struggles with ideals in a society built on bribery and corruption. Achebe then turns back the clock in Arrow of God, to continue the story of the destruction of Igbo culture in the colonial years. Described as the father of modern African literature, Achebe opened the door to African writing in English. In an article in the New Gong magazine, columnist Henry Chukwuemeka Onyema suggests that Things Fall Apart's singular achievement was that it told us about ourselves through our own eyes. Onyema describes the 1960s in Nigeria as a literary ferment, as writers sought to define the newly independent nation and to make sense of its contradictions. Among them was playwright and novelist Wole Soyinka, who was awarded the 1986 Nobel Prize in Literature. An abominable religion has settled among you. A man can now leave his father and his brothers. I fear for you, I fear for the clan. Things Fall Apart. Confronting oppression. Later generations of Nigerian writers continued to grapple with the aftermath of colonialism, civil war, and cultural conflict. In 1991, Ben Okri was awarded the Booker Prize for The Famished Road, in which a spirit child faces down death to become part of the lives of real people. Women writers such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie have also found a voice engaging with Nigeria's turbulent political history and exploring the place of women in a male-dominated culture. In Adichie's debut novel, Purple Hibiscus, The narrator is a 15-year-old girl struggling to emerge from the repression of a patriarchal Catholic upbringing. Other writers have explored a wide range of modern-day issues, such as homosexuality, prostitution, and environmental degradation, from a Nigerian perspective. Chinua Achebe. Born in 1930 in the small town of Ajidai, southeast Nigeria, to Protestant parents, Chinua Achebe spoke Igbo at home and English at school. He graduated from University College, Ibadan, in 1952, and within 12 years had written the 3 novels that were to become the foundation of his oeuvre. Achebe married Christy Chinua Akoli in 1961, and they had 4 children. An early career in radio ended with the outbreak of the Biafran War. Achebe went on to teach in the USA and Nigeria, and wrote stories, poetry, essays, and children's books. In 1990 a car crash left him confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. In 1992 he became professor of languages and literature at Bard College, New York, and in 2009 he moved to Brown University, Rhode Island. In 2007 Achebe was awarded the Man Booker International Prize for Fiction. He died in March 2013, aged 82. Other key works: 1960 No Longer at Ease, and 1964 Arrow of God, 1966 A Man of the People, 1987 Anthills of the Savannah. See also, Heart of Darkness, Disgrace, Half of a Yellow Sun. In context. Focus. The unreliable narrator before 1884. The naive boy hero in Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn fails to understand the significance of events that is clear to readers. 1955 Humbert's narrative is assembled from notes made in an asylum and presented after his death in Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. After 1962 delinquent teenager Alex confesses all in Nadsat, a futuristic teen speak, in Anthony Burgess's novel A Clockwork Orange. 1991 Bret Easton Ellis's serial killer speaks through a yuppie archetype in American Psycho. 2001 Jan Martel's narrator stretches credulity in Life of Pi, with his tale of life adrift with a tiger, and then offers a different option. The term unreliable narrator refers to first-person narrators who undermine the authority of their own stories. Realist novels tend to offer a rational speaking voice telling a story that meets a reader's expectations. But what if the narrator gives the reader reason to doubt, because he or she is insane, or has a distorted perception of the world, or is very young, or lying? Texts of the 20th century are littered with slippery speakers, from Humbert in Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita to Patrick Bateman in Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho. But unreliable narrators have been around for centuries, and include Jonathan Swift's naive Gulliver and Mark Twain's ingenuous Huckleberry Finn. Executed well, novels with unreliable narrators engage the reader differently. That element of doubt both stretches credulity and draws the reader in. In the midst of history. Günter Grass has been described as the conscience of a nation for his darkly satirical portrait of the rise of Nazi sympathies in ordinary families and the aftermath of the war in the Tin Drum. Anyone seeking an example of an unreliable narrator need look no further than the stunted hero of the novel, Oscar Matzerath. Oscar introduces himself from his bed in a mental hospital where he has been held following his trial for murder. He explains that until the age of 20 he was just 3 feet tall, having arrested his own growth on his 3rd birthday by sheer force of will. History is happening all around, but the spotlight focuses on the fierce, tiny figure of Oscar, with his constant companion, a tin drum, and a scream that can break glass. He has 2 possible fathers, his mother's lover, or her husband, who runs a grocery store in the free city of Danzig, which is under German control. Oscar is a witness to real events in history in Danzig and Dusseldorf, but, obsessed with his own needs, he is no hero. Over the years he is implicated in a string of deaths. I stuck to my drum and didn't grow a finger's breadth from my 3rd birthday on. The Tin Drum. Unlikely truths. Sometimes the narration slips into the 3rd person, or is passed to Oscar's jailer to allow another perspective. The tone varies. A slaughter of nuns on a Normandy beach is scripted like a drawing room farce, while Oscar's poetic voice both enchants and revolts as he describes a fisherman hauling up a horse's head writhing with eels. He diverts us down the blind alleys of his obsessions with art, circus dwarfs, nurses, and the sense of women he seduces. He offers a rational history of Danzig, then conjures up a nightclub called the Onion Cellar where people chop raw onions to make themselves cry. What does Oscar represent? Perhaps he is the devil, using his scream to cut holes in shop windows to tempt passers-by to steal, or seducing women by ingenious means. Or perhaps he embodies Grass's perception of Germany, immune to suffering during Nazism and quick to bury the past. What is certain, however, is that through Oscar's grim magical fantasy the author found a way to drum history into memory. Unreliable narrators come in different guises, some are liars or conceal facts, others are unstable, confused, or manipulative. They may be immature or unaware, reporting events that the reader perceives differently. Günter Grass. Born in 1927 in Danzig to a German father and Kashubian mother, Günter Grass attended the Konradinum Gymnasium and was a member of the Hitler Youth. In late 1944, at the age of 17, he was drafted into the Waffen-SS, as he revealed controversially in 2006. After the war, Grass worked as a miner and farm laborer, and studied art, before working as a sculptor and writer in Paris and Berlin. He published his first poetry and plays in 1955, but his breakthrough came in 1959 with The Tin Drum, which was followed by two further novels that made up the Danzig trilogy. In 1999 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, one of many awards during his career. Grass was heavily involved in German politics, supporting the Social Democratic Party and opposing reunification. He died in 2015 aged 87. Other key works: 1961 Cat and Mouse, 1963 Dog Years, 1999 My Century, 2002 Crabwalk. See also, Tristram Shandy, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Lolita, A Clockwork Orange, American Psycho. In context. Focus Southern Gothic. Before 1940 Carson McCullers' debut novel The Heart is a Lonely Hunter encapsulates the elements of Southern Gothic in a story of social misfits in Georgia in the 1930s. 1955 Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, by playwright Tennessee Williams, is set on a cotton plantation in the Mississippi Delta and challenges Southern social conventions with its portrayal of the favorite son as a repressed gay man and alcoholic. After 1980 A Confederacy of Dunces, by John Kennedy Toole, is set in New Orleans and follows the antics of slob and misfit Ignatius J. Riley. Toole is posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for the book a year after its publication. Building on the traditions of 18th-century Gothic literature, with its elements of fantasy and the grotesque, mid-20th century writers of the American Deep South, such as Tennessee Williams, Flannery O'Connor, and Carson McCullers, established a literary genre known as Southern Gothic. These writers used the characteristics of the traditional Gothic style to inspect the unsettling realities and twisted psyches beneath the surface of Southern respectability. With their damaged or eccentric characters, macabre settings, and sinister situations, the texts in this genre examine Southern social issues such as racism, poverty, and crime. Harper Lee's classic novel To Kill a Mockingbird incorporates a coming-of-age theme into the Southern Gothic genre, and highlights racial prejudice in the American South in the years before the Civil Rights Movement. It also explores the behavior of those who live in a small Southern community. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. To Kill a Mockingbird. Challenging convention. The story is set in the mid-1930s in Macomb, an Alabama town where the day was 24 hours long but seemed much longer. The narrator is a young girl, Scout, aged nearly 6 at the start of events. She is a tomboy, who questions social conventions. Scout lives with her widowed father, lawyer Atticus Finch, her brother Jem, and their black cook, Calpurnia. Scout describes daily life in Macomb, their neighbors, her friendship with an unusual boy called Dill, and her school, creating a picture of an apparently timeless society in the Deep South. Heat bakes the streets, refined ladies gossip at missionary teas, poor white children arrive at school with no shoes, and black people live segregated lives as land workers or domestic servants. In Southern Gothic tradition, however, there are oddities in the community, in particular the reclusive Boo Radley, who lives in a supposedly haunted house, and about whom the children weave fantastical tales. When Atticus agrees to take on the defense of a local black man, Tom Robinson, who is falsely accused of raping a white woman, Scout describes the tensions and violence created by Atticus's determination to defend Robinson, in spite of the fact that, as he admits, it is a lost cause. Following the trial there is a murderous attack on the children, which reveals Boo Radley to be guardian, not a monster. The novel ends with Scout older, wiser, and reflecting on human behavior within her small community. Published as the civil rights movement was accelerating, To Kill a Mockingbird was an almost instant bestseller. Despite its gentle tone, the novel, like others in the genre, exposed the darkness underpinning the gentility of a Southern community forced to face the reality of racial hatred. Over the course of the novel, Scout's perception of the world around her matures from a naive ideal to a more realistic understanding of society, but she nevertheless retains her optimism. Harper Lee. Born in the town of Monroeville, Alabama, on April 28, 1926, Harper Lee was a loner and a tomboy. Her father was a lawyer, and her best friend was the author Truman Capote. Lee attended the University of Alabama, where she edited the University magazine. Although she started law school, she wanted to write, and in 1949 dropped out and moved to New York. In 1956 close friends offered to fund her for a year so that she could write. Taking inspiration from events and people in her childhood, she started To Kill a Mockingbird, which she completed in 1959. The tremendous success of To Kill a Mockingbird gained Lee many literary awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. She accepted a post on the National Council of the Arts but largely retired from public life from the 1970s. It was believed that Lee had only ever written one book, but in 2015 Go Set a Watchman, her second novel, was published. Although a sequel, it was written before To Kill a Mockingbird. See also, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Sound and the Fury, Invisible Man. In Cold Blood. In Context. Focus, the anti-novel. Before. 1605 Don Quixote, by Miguel de Cervantes, is regarded as the first modern novel, but its literary features and episodic structure are at odds with later definitions of the genre. 1939 At Swim Two Birds by Irish author Flann O'Brien has multiple characters and plots that lose linear structure. After. 1973 The Castle of Crossed Destinies, by Italian author Italo Calvino, has multiple plots, each is determined by a randomly chosen sequence of tarot cards. 2001 Bartleby and County, by Spanish writer Enrique Villamatas, revolves around unwritten texts, fragmented notes, footnotes, literary allusions, and comments on authors both real and fictional. One of the distinguishing features of the novel is generally thought to be the sequential, linear organization of its narrative segments. Chapters, more or less in sequence, are presumed or expected to hold equal status with each other, from a narrative perspective. The anti-novel, first named as such by French writer Jean-Paul Sartre in the mid-20th century, subverts this assumption, marking a radical departure from the conventional novel with respect to plot, dialogue, and structure. In the case of Argentine writer Julio Cortázar's Hopscotch, the novel is subverted even from a physical point of view. The reader of an anti-novel is forced to suspend all narrative expectations and to engage with the text in ways that a traditional work of fiction does not require. As the reader of Hopscotch is told in the book's table of instructions, in its own way, this book consists of many books, but two books above all. References to jazz appear throughout Hopscotch, not only in its subject matter but also in its jazz-infused language, nonlinear structure, and improvisational approach. An open-ended book. Hopscotch can be read as a straightforward novel, the first book, one chapter after the other, or as a second story, skipping from the so-called expendable chapter 73 to 1, back and forth, all the way to 58 and 131, where the reader gets caught in an endless loop of the latter two. The author also allows the reader to explore the novel in any other sequence, and to ignore the expendable chapters entirely. Even in the more linear option, the plot moves in an erratic fashion, capturing a series of fragments as it follows the main character, Horacio Oliveira, initially in 1950s Paris. We discover Oliveira's intellectual interests and his passion for jazz, a form of music that was a clear influence on Cortázar's style, with its staccato, syncopated rhythm. We hear of Oliveira's discussions with fellow members of the vaguely defined Serpent Club, their reverence for mysterious author Morelli, and Oliveira's love of La Mega. Eventually, he heads to Argentina, where he finds work in an asylum. Hopscotch invites the reader to experiment with different pathways through its pages. There is a normal first book of 56 chapters, and a second making use of 99 expendable chapters. Each book can be read separately, and there are also several alternative options. Narrative strategies. The second book takes Argentina as its stage. In some expendable chapters, Cortázar's belief that the reader should be aware of the workings of a novel, as participant and even conspirator, can be detected, ultimately destroying the status of the text itself as a novel. Cortázar's depiction of mental deterioration, disconnected and alienating human interaction, and forced travel across countries is mirrored in the effects that the book as an object demands of the reader. In this way, the author successfully draws attention to the text's fictional constructs, as well as to the expectations that we have of the novel form. Chess world where you moved about like a knight trying to move like a rook trying to move like a bishop. Hopscotch. Julio Cortázar. Julio Cortázar was born to Argentinian parents in Belgium in 1914. His family moved to Switzerland at the beginning of World War I, but settled in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in 1919. Cortázar became qualified as a teacher at an early age, and began his university studies in philosophy and language in Buenos Aires, but these were interrupted owing to financial difficulties. In 1951 he emigrated to France, where he worked as a translator while constantly traveling and writing short stories. He became engaged in political causes, supporting the left-wing movements in Cuba and mainland Latin America, which he visited several times from the 1960s onwards. Around the same time, his novels, including Hopscotch, started being published. Cortázar died in 1984, aged 69, and is buried in Paris. Other key works. 1960 The Winners. 1967 Blow Up and Other Stories. 1968-62, A Model Kit. 1973 A Manual for Manuel. See also, Don Quixote Tristram Shandy The Outsider If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. In context. Focus. American Black Humor Before. 1939 The Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West satirizes the grotesque vanity of Hollywood and its hangers-on during the Great Depression. 1959 Philip Roth's fiction collection Goodbye, Columbus humorously deals with the dark or taboo side of subjects such as sex, religion, and cultural assimilation. After. 1966 Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49 explores the failure of communication and the absurd and disordered nature of the world. 1969 The Search for Meaning in Increasingly Fractured Times is satirized in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, inspired by the author's experience of the firebombing of Dresden and the absurdity of war. With a fascination for the morbid and the taboo, black humor uses farce to make light of controversial or serious issues. Such humor often comes from despair or horror and frequently highlights the futility of life. Many dark, satirical novels came out of the USA in the latter half of the 20th century, when the nation assumed leadership of the West after the shattering of Europe through 2 world wars, and the onset of the Cold War nuclear age. The Madness of Sanity. Catch-22, the satirical novel by U.S. writer Joseph Heller, is set in World War II, although the book can be read as a commentary on the ongoing Vietnam War. It follows the exploits of Captain Yossarian and his fellow airmen, who serve on bombing missions. Unmoved by patriotism, Yossarian is furious that his life is at risk. Convinced he is surrounded by crazed idiots, he tries to avoid his missions by faking illness. Yet he and his comrades are in a catch-22 situation. They can apply for discharge on the grounds of insanity, but the very process of claiming madness using the correct protocol proves their sanity, and so they must continue to fly. The madness of war so clearly seen by Yossarian is underscored through Heller's use of paradox, absurdity, and the kind of circular reasoning exemplified by Catch 22 itself. True to the conventions of black humor, the novel is by turns bleak, hilarious, and tragic. Anything worth dying for is certainly worth living for. Catch 22. See also, The Crying of Lot 49, Slaughterhouse 5, American Psycho. In context. Focus post-war poetry. Before 1945.